This is Siwar, and Siwar, she's 5 months old. She is severely, acutely malnourished. If you look at her little legs, she just has the skin on her bones. When she cries, you can't barely hear the sound because she's so exhausted.
Hello, I'm Riz Khan. UNICEF's video reports from the ground in Gaza illustrate the challenge they're facing to prevent 14,000 babies from starving to death in the war-torn Palestinian territory. But the Israeli government has dismissed famine concerns as, quote, Hamas-driven false narratives. In this episode, we bring you a first-hand account of the dire conditions in Gaza from the humanitarian aid workers' perspective. This week, tragedy struck a classroom in Gaza when it was reduced to rubble by an Israeli airstrike. Children sheltering there were killed. In another devastating incident, 2 Palestinian doctors lost 9 of their 10 children. Their sole surviving child is critically injured. The Israeli Defense Forces say they were targeting militants and continue to accuse Hamas of embedding fighters among civilians. But the escalating military campaign is severely restricting the flow of humanitarian aid, and hundreds of thousands of families are forced to search for a dwindling number of safe spaces. Rosalia Bollen runs a UNICEF team in Gaza and shares a daily struggle to help Palestinian families survive the continuing conflict. She joins me now to share a raw and very personal perspective on what it means to try to protect children in the middle of one of the world's most complex and dangerous conflicts. Rosalia, it's good to have you on the show. Let's start with the tragic story of the 2 Palestinian doctors who lost 9 of their children in a bombing. The son who survived is not in good shape either, and it's said that maybe even the father might be in a very critical condition. What's been the reaction in Gaza, and how do moments like this affect the wider conversation on the conflict?
Oh, this is an extremely tragic story in itself, but what's maybe even more tragic is that it's not a unique case. In fact, children continue to be killed on a daily basis. Tents are being hit, schools turned into shelters, and sometimes entire families are killed at once, like in the case of this doctor who's working in central Gaza. People are exhausted. They're exhausted physically. They're exhausted mentally. And these bombardments that continue mean that children and their parents are stuck in a permanent state of stress. I exited Gaza a short while ago, and I've just felt it firsthand. You hear the buzzing of the planes, you hear planes approaching, and you're just constantly on edge because a bomb is going to fall. You don't know where, you wonder if it'll be close to you, and then you just wait for that explosion, and those few seconds until the explosion, they seem like an eternity. It's absolutely terrifying, and the attacks have been intensifying over the past couple of days. There's a very morbid child casualty toll that we keep track of since the resumption of the military operations on March 18th. At least 1,230 children have been reported killed. That was up to 23 May, and thousands more have been injured. I actually think personally that the term injured isn't adequate enough. The children that I've come across during my time in Gaza, some have very severe burns, including over the entirety of their bodies. They have shrapnel lodged in their tiny bodies, bullets that doctors find difficult to extract.
كنت قاعدة في الخيمة، كنت نايمة، أجا الشظايا عليا، بعدين أجا أسعفوني وأخذوني إنه أعيش وإيدي تتحسن وأصير ألعب فيها.
They have fractures, they've had to be amputated from limbs. So we're talking about children who will carry the consequences of these attacks with them for the rest of their lifetime.
Well, I'll get into details in a moment, but with these devastating events becoming so frequent, do you think the world has to any degree become desensitized? Or do stories like the 2 doctors and their 10 children and the tragic consequence of what happened to them have the power to stop the conflict, or at least cause a pause?
I mean, for sure, the numbers are overwhelming. The latest child fatality count for the entirety of the war is at least 16,500 children who've been reported killed, and those are children who've been killed in airstrikes, in explosions. There's also lots of children who have died sort of as a secondary consequence of this war. I, for instance, have interviewed countless children who were severely ill, including an 11-year-old boy with leukemia. And after I interview these children, a couple of days or weeks later, I usually check in with the parents to see how the child is doing, and also what type of support they've been receiving from UNICEF. In Islam's case, I interviewed him end of October, and when I checked in mid-November, turned out that he had passed away because of care not being available inside the Gaza Strip. So the suffering, the deaths go beyond the bombs and the bullets. Children are also dying as a result of the living conditions. I fondly hope that there will be action taken. We're entering the 20th month of this war. It's unconscionable that this continues on a daily basis. And when people feel overwhelmed around the world, they should remember that these aren't numbers. These are sons and daughters. These are babies. That's what we're talking about. And these children, not only did they do anything to set off this war, not only aren't they responsible for the war, they also don't have the means to get out of the situation that they're in.
Considering how bad things are, Rosalia, let's find out what's the latest you've been getting from what's going on the ground in Gaza in terms of humanitarian aid, because as you've described, the conditions are pretty bad.
Yes, so since the beginning of last week, on May 19th, UNICEF and the World Food Programme were authorized to bring in very limited quantities of food and nutrition support. So that in itself is a very welcome development, considering the total blockade on aid and goods into the Gaza Strip for over 2.5 months. The reality is that these quantities that we were allowed to bring in are vastly insufficient to meet the needs of children in Gaza today. UNICEF also, when I say nutrition support, we're not bringing in food that you're going to find in the supermarket or on the markets. We're not bringing in fresh produce, dairy products, meat. The type of supplies that we bring in are very specialized. They're meant as ready to use therapeutic food for children who risk becoming malnourished or who are already malnourished. There are little sachets with a sort of a paste in it that is fortified, and that the children can just suck directly out of the sachet. And it's baby food that is meant to be complementary as well. So it's specialized food that is meant for the most vulnerable children inside Gaza.
And of course, for the babies, because many of the mothers are so undernourished, they can't produce milk. I'm guessing this is part of the plan when it comes to the kind of products you get in.
So the malnutrition screening that we do is focused not just on children under 5, but is also focused on pregnant women and breastfeeding women. And because of the aid blockade and really the deteriorating situation on the ground, we have had to adjust our analysis and malnutrition estimates for 2025. You may have seen that in May, actually the beginning of this month, we've brought out new analysis, which has established that if things stay the way that they are, there will be at least 71,000 children who are acutely malnourished and who would need support in the year to come, and there will be at least 17,000 women who will also be malnourished. And indeed, pregnant women are particularly affected. pregnant women who are malnourished, they risk giving birth to babies with congenital malformations, babies with low birth weight. We risk to see a lot of premature births. It's not just the nutrition situation, it's really the combination of permanent stress, lack of access to sanitary facilities, spread of disease, the very difficult living situations that people are in. And that is equally affecting the ability of women to breastfeed. They have to share a tent with all their relatives. They don't have any privacy. They're not well nourished themselves, so they may not produce enough breast milk. So there's lots of obstacles to women and children in Gaza.
Rosalia, the numbers are staggering. Of course, when put to the Israeli government, they often deny that those numbers are accurate because they say these are obviously done with basically an affinity for the Palestinian side, and the aid agencies often get the finger pointed at them. How do you react when you hear that kind of thing?
Well, when it comes to, for instance, numbers in relation to malnutrition, UNICEF is present throughout Gaza, and we support something called mid-upper arm circumference measurements. That's jargon for malnutrition screening. So this is a global methodology that is applied everywhere in the world. And in UNICEF supported malnutrition clinics, treatment clinics around Gaza, we carry out these screenings on a daily basis. So we actually have data from the ground where we can see that there is a significant deterioration.
I'm presuming this mid-upper arm circumference measurement you mentioned is a quick and easy one to do, and it's regarded as accurate in terms of malnutrition, yeah?
Absolutely. So it's done globally. It's not done specifically in Gaza. And the people who the health professionals who carry out these screenings have been trained on the protocols to carry out this type of measurements. Also, I mean, if you think about it for a second, it really shouldn't come as a surprise that there's an increase in malnutrition when you have first 15 months of war where aid is coming in only on a drip feed, really just a trickle of what is needed. Then we have 6 weeks of ceasefire where humanitarian organizations are able to scale up, but because the needs are so high, we immediately distribute the supplies that we have, or we try to distribute them as fast as we can. But we're not going to sit on them. We're not going to use them to build stocks in our warehouses. And then you have 2.5 months of aid blockade. It's not just aid. Nothing has entered the Gaza Strip since March 2nd. I mean, think about your own town that you live in. If your own town becomes under a total siege, obviously things are going to run out pretty fast. Food, medicines, hygiene supplies. What do you expect under these circumstances?
Rosalia, with the numbers that we're talking here, there are some who call this a genocide. Others push back on that term, of course. Based on what you've seen, how do you tend to describe it?
I mean, I'm always getting a little bit desperate when I hear these type of debates, because what we see on the ground is children being killed, children being mutilated, children being starved, children dying because of a lack of medical care that is available to them. All the while, life-saving aid is ready to be brought into Gaza immediately if humanitarian organizations were allowed to do so. UNICEF alone has the equivalent of 1,000 trucks in life-saving aid ready to be moved into Gaza immediately if we get green light. It's as with the debate around famine. I think what is important here is that this is happening now. We shouldn't wait for a group of experts to officially declare famine. We know that children are dying from hunger. We know that that is happening right now, and it is a process. It is literally a process, starvation. You know, the children that we've come across who are acutely malnourished and who are part of sort of the most severe category, severe acute malnutrition, they look like skeletons because first the body eats the fat of the body and then it eats the muscles. And so these children are just bones with skin around it. They're too weak to cry. They're just lethargic on hospital beds or in their tents. And these children are dying right now, and we need action right now to be taken.
In this hospital, like in the entire Gaza Strip, there is not enough medical supplies, nutritious food, which are specialized to treat a little baby like this. We have more and more children affected by malnutrition. This must stop.
The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has described the amount of aid getting in as a trickle when he said a flood is essentially needed. What impact do you think his comments have had, and what might that do to the state of the situation now?
Well, we fondly hope that not only we can continue bringing in these supplies, but we also hope that we can bring in considerably more. So for UNICEF, dozens of trucks have entered over the past week. But at the height of the ceasefire, between 600 to 900 trucks were entering on a daily basis. And so we really need to get back to that scale. We need to arrive at scale, and not just humanitarian supplies, but also commercial supplies. Nowhere in the world do you have a population that can survive solely on humanitarian aid. So humanitarian aid is supposed to be a band-aid. As I said, the type of supplies that we bring in, for instance, the nutrition supplies, they're highly specialized, almost medicinal nutrition supplements for specific categories of very vulnerable children. You're not going to find that in the market, but families need to be able to buy family food in the market. If they were able to buy vegetable, fruit, dairy, fish, meat, bread, rice, potatoes, everything, if they had access to that, we wouldn't be where we are today. So besides humanitarian aid, we also need commercial goods to be allowed to enter. It's an illusion to think that a couple of humanitarian organizations can sustain a population of over 2 million individuals.
There are reports of the humanitarian aid trucks being looted by armed men. Israel says it's the Hamas militia that are taking the aid, while others say basically the situation is so desperate that people are doing anything they can to get hold of the supplies. What's your experience of what goes on there in terms of at least securing the aid?
The problem at hand is really a problem of basic economics. It's a problem of scarcity. Here too, we can ask ourselves, what else can we expect when we have a territory that is under siege, that has run out of products, and where it hence will become very lucrative to get a hold of the products that do enter, to try to resell them.
I am here in Khan Yunis in one of the supermarkets where all the shelves are completely depleted. Those shelves have been empty for more than 2 weeks. There is only a little bit of baking powder and sesame seeds available. The prices of basic goods like potatoes or tomatoes have skyrocketed. 1 kilo of potatoes cost more than $11. These prices are so high that the most vulnerable families, most of the families here in the Gaza Strip, including the children behind me, cannot afford it.
It's an artificially created problem. If aid is allowed in at scale, that will automatically diffuse the tension. It'll automatically take away the pressure that we right now have on the market. It will reassure families that there is going to be enough for everyone, so that they don't feel the desperate need to try and get their hands on aid supplies. As to the presence of these criminal groups that try also to hijack the convoys, what we need is a minimum of law and order, the restoration of law and order. We need there to be a civilian police who can help us to do that. We're not asking for the militarization of Gaza. We're not asking for armed escorts of our convoys. I need to state that really clearly.
While there is a lack of aid, the situation gets worse, and some of the descriptions, in fact, you yourself have put out in reports, are quite horrific and heartbreaking. Children basically scavenging for food or items to burn because of the shortage of fuel. They're in freezing conditions without proper clothing or shoes even, and disease setting in, affecting even the youngest. How do you cope with all that emotionally yourself?
And everyone copes with it differently. It is really it is unbearable to witness. It is truly unbearable because these children are innocent. They have nothing to do with it. At the same time, me personally, I'm driven to continue this line of work because the need is so high, and I know that the little bit of aid that we do get in, that it is going to be life-saving. Besides distributing aid, UNICEF also supports service provision. And something that we've been focused on over the past couple of months is the strengthening of neonatal care in Gaza. So lots of babies are born prematurely, lots of babies are born with complications. And there's very low capacity to care for moms and their newborns because hospitals have been attacked. Because of the blockade, there's not enough supplies. Something that UNICEF does is that we install incubators and CPAP machines, which are ventilators. They're really important for premature babies because the lungs of premature babies aren't fully developed yet. And these ventilators help babies breathe. They are not able to breathe autonomously if they're only 7 or 8 months old. So we install these incubators, we install these ventilators, all sorts of equipment in hospitals throughout Gaza. Then we go back 2 or 3 days later to make sure that everything functions as it should. We have trained personnel there also to make sure that they are comfortable manipulating and using the equipment. And every time we go back, we see tiny babies in these incubators or hooked up to these ventilators that we just installed less than 48 hours ago. And that's where you realize, okay, if it wasn't for that incubator and that ventilator, that baby wouldn't have survived. So that's probably what is an important driving factor.
Rosalia, give us an example of what would be a typical day for you in Gaza, if there is such a thing, and how has the renewed military operation by Israel affected that?
Before the resumption of the military operations, usually my colleagues and I get up at 6 a.m. We get into our cars around 7:30 to drive over to our central office, and then from there we dispatch to locations where UNICEF is implementing programming. So, for instance, where we distribute supplies, where in hospitals where we work with local doctors to install the specialized equipment I just mentioned. We go to desalination plants that we support to produce water. We do water trucking, so lots of different interventions. So we go to those sites for monitoring and evaluation. Me specifically, I go on missions on a daily basis to interview children and to document the situation of children. And then towards the end of the day, we return to our guest houses. We have to be back before dark. And we process the information and the documentation that we've been able to collect during the day. With the resumption of the military operations, there's a large number of our distribution sites that have had to close. For instance, when it comes to UNICEF-supported malnutrition treatment centers, clinics, nearly half had to close because they are now in a zone under displacement order or because the community that this center was servicing has been displaced, has moved. So that's a very important impact. And the other element here is the insecurity, not just for the population, but also for civilians like us, for humanitarians. As a matter of fact, one of my international colleagues was killed end of March from a sister UN sister agency, and countless local colleagues have been killed as well. So it's increasingly difficult for us to do our jobs and to be able to move around.
Israel claims that its strikes are directly targeted at the Hamas's militia, and it also claims a high degree of accuracy of the strikes to avoid civilian casualties. Now, many people, of course, say that the large death toll, including many women and children, refutes what Israel says. Based on your experience on the ground, how do you assess Israel's claims?
The numbers speak for themselves, don't they? Just over the past 2 months, over 1,200 children killed, often in their sleep, in their tents, in schools that have been repurposed as shelters, in hospitals where they were seeking care, which is why the UN and other organizations have been saying throughout this war that no place is safe in Gaza, even more so. So at present, 81% of the territory of the Gaza Strip is either under displacement order or in a militarized zone, in for instance, a buffer zone. So there's only 19% of the Gaza Strip left for people to go to, which is incredible if you realize how small the Gaza Strip is. It's a high densely populated territory, but also in that 19% that is left, we also see airstrikes on a daily basis. For instance, in the Rafah al-Mawasi area, where one of the UNICEF guest houses is, in fact, it's the guest house where I stay. We've had airstrikes, Navy shelling, drones, quadcopter strikes on a near daily basis. So there is no safe place in Gaza for children and their parents.
Do you ever really fear for your life, Rosalia?
There's been a couple of moments where I felt terrified, actually, specifically on the 18th of March, with the resumption of the military operations. We could tell that this time was different. It started with like 20 minutes in the middle of the night of non-stop explosions. Every time the sound of an explosion would die down, I could hear people yelling, screaming for help. I could hear the sound of ambulances arriving. And then after that, those first 20 very intense minutes, on almost minute from minute, there were explosions, including in the near vicinity of the UNICEF guest house. This is the reality of children and their parents in Gaza. There is no respite. They haven't had, apart from the ceasefire, they haven't had a single moment where for a brief period they can let their guard down, and they don't have to be concerned with, am I going to make it through the coming hour? Children speak about death a lot. Something that children are afraid of is dying, but something that terrifies them even more is the thought that their parents will be killed and they will survive and they will be left on their own. It's abnormal for children to have to think about dying constantly and to be trapped in that permanent state of stress, very toxic stress.
I'm going to get back to the issue that children face in a moment, but one of the other things that Israel says is that its military action is aimed at getting its hostages back. Now, what do the Palestinian population of Gaza themselves say about the hostages? Is it a subject that's discussed much?
So the parents and the children that I have interviewed, they don't speak about politics in general. But when I ask them about their life, their reflections on what's going on, the type of things that children will say is, I miss my bedroom. I miss my toys. I miss the neighbors' kids. I miss having a hot meal. I miss sweets. I miss this. I miss that. Parents, they overwhelmingly speak about their despair when it comes to the future of their children. It seems that parents sort of acknowledge that their own generation is lost, but they desperately want something better for their children. And so they come when I ask them what it is that they need, or just more generically their reflections, they ask that we work to reopening the schools even under the bumps, because they're so worried that their children have lost already 2 years of schools, that they'll be behind. They ask for jobs. The population in Gaza is generally actually highly educated. Lots of people speak English well. They ask me if there's any jobs at UNICEF. So they don't even ask for assistance, but they want an income. They want to be able to sustain themselves. It goes without saying that the hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally, but it's not really something that's on the minds of families in Gaza. They're too busy surviving.
Nama Levy, one of the Israeli hostages who was released, literally just made a statement recently about her biggest fear while she was in captivity was the bombing that was occurring by the Israeli military, and her fear that she would be a victim of the bombing. And she says that the current hostages are probably fearing that pretty much more than anything else as well. Now, I wonder what exposure you've had to Israelis who obviously are concerned about what's going on. They want the hostages released. Some of them obviously protesting against their own government. What of the Israeli voices have you heard?
My exposure to that has been very limited, to be quite frank, because I'm based in Gaza. But this war isn't bringing any good for anyone. The longer it continues, the more long term this will reverberate. The longer term the consequences will be. We have an entire generation of children who've been out of school, who are deeply traumatized, who are hungry, exhausted, who are in despair. And so the longer that this lasts, the harder it'll be to get out of this, and the harder it'll be to have a permanent resolution of this conflict.
Many Israelis also live in fear of being attacked. I mean, life in Israel for many is based around bomb shelters and safety training and so on. How do you think the mental health of the Israeli children who are exposed to this over the long term has been affected?
I imagine that they are deeply traumatized too. To have to think about or to have to fear for your life is extremely harmful to children, including to Israeli children. They shouldn't have to fear for their lives.
There is a sense, that this extended conflict has a really detrimental effect on both sides and just breeds hate and contempt for the other side in each new generation. I wonder, from your perspective and what you've witnessed, how is that going to change?
I mean, on the one hand, I do think it's intuitive that this logic of violence begets violence. At the same time, the families that I've interacted with, not a single person, when I speak to them about the war and about the suffering, not a single person talks about revenge or wanting to destroy another group. The way that parents and children articulate their situation and their aspirations for the future is very much in terms of, I had always wanted to be a doctor, a journalist, an artist. I'm so worried. I want to go back to school. I miss school. I miss my home. Why do I have to live in this tent? What did I do? I had a very nice bedroom for myself. I had lots of toys. I've lost it all. Why? What? And so it seems that at this moment, people are very much concerned with sort of daily survival. But on the longer term, this trauma may be passed on from generation to generation, which is why, again, we need to end these hostilities immediately.